Hei, god kveld og hjertelig velkommen til dette arrangementet på KÅKÅnomics. Dette arrangementet blir på engelsk, så jeg skal legge om øyet straks, fordi vi har en I panelet som en gjest fra det store utland. So, welcome to KÅKÅnomics, the biggest and funniest economics festival in the Nordics. If it's the only one, I'm not quite sure, but I'm sure it's going to be the most fun one. And especially welcome to this event called Economic Sanctions. Do they work? My name is Atle Simonsen, and I will lead this session. Firstly, just some information about the festival. We have still more available tickets for other events, and there's an updated program at KÅKÅnomics.no. Be sure to try to find all these interesting events that is occurring during the week. An economic festival, I know it sounds like a contradiction, but this is a festival both for professionals and the general public. One of the main points of KÅKÅnomics is to create engagement to political, economical issues in a way that makes partly complicated issues relevant to more of the general public. We have around 60 minutes to discuss quite a complex issue, but we're going to try to make it worth your while. We will open for questions towards the end, but then I mean questions, not speeches and lectures, but questions. The only one who gets to elaborate on this is this beautiful panel we have with us today. But we're going to talk about economic sanctions and the war that's going on in Europe. The war has huge consequences for people and also for the economy. One of the easiest weapons to resort to in an escalating conflict is to introduce economic sanctions. If we want to punish another country, we introduce sanctions. And if they do not work, we introduce more sanctions. Are we fooling ourselves so that we feel empowered when we introduce these sanctions? Do they actually have any effect on the country subject to them? Europe is at war against Russia. Ukraine is in a military war, while other European countries are in a sanctions war or an economical war. Both the Russian people and residents of other countries are feeling these sanctions and suffering. But to what end? These are some of the complex questions we are asking in today's debate. And we have invited a great panel of speakers. Let me introduce them. To my left is Marianne Dahl, which is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. We have Behné Ramsnes, who's a partner at Schjødt, working with economic sanctions as a specialty. We have Bård Bjerkholt from Dagens NæringslivPresenter. We have also Ragnar Torvik, who's an economist professor at NTNU, and also all the way from Netherlands, Peter van Bergeijk, professor of international economics and macroeconomics at the Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University. But first, just to get us all on the same playing field, we're going to invite Marianne and Thomas to help us understand what are these sanctions and what are we trying to do with these sanctions. If we could start with you, Thomas. You work with Norwegian businesses and then try to help them navigate in this jungle of new sanctions happening all the time. Could you speak a little bit about what these sanctions actually are and how they affect us here?
Certainly. So yeah, I guess everybody can hear me. So just the starting point, what is sanctions? So sanctions is essentially a foreign policy tool, which is non-military. So the point is that the authorities that impose them have quite a broad discretion. So they can take a range of forms, ranging from sort of general trade embargoes, essentially blocking all trade with a nation. But then in the latest decades, we have seen sort of a shift in the trend of sanctions toward more targeted sanctions. The general point of targeted sanctions is sort of to focus the effect of sanctions to try to limit the collateral damage, limit the negative impacts on innocent third parties, and then focus on the parties that are really targeted. So what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that for instance, it might take the form of you have a list of specific listed persons or companies that are designated, and then you are essentially blocked by trading with them, and there you are also required to freeze their assets. And then another form may be, for instance, you have a range of equipment. For instance, in the case of Russia, you have petroleum-related equipment, and then there's a specified list, and then you are restricted from exporting that type of equipment to Russia, say, in that case. So who imposes the sanctions? That is probably a follow-up question, and that essentially a group of states acting through international bodies. So you have, for instance, the UN or the EU. The problem with UN is that, of course, it's this Security Council that imposes sanctions. And in the Security Council, you have permanent members with veto rights. So it's difficult, if not impossible, to get countries like Russia or China to impose sanctions against themselves or against their allies. So that has meant that there's a limit of what, in practice, that EU and UN imposes. So the result of that is that the EU has largely then more and more increasingly come to impose sanctions on their own, either as an alternative if the UN has not imposed any sanctions, or as a supplement if they don't believe that the UN sanctions are strong enough. And then in addition to that, you also have some countries that unilaterally decide to impose sanctions on their own. Norway do not do that. We tend to largely follow the EU, but you have key international players such as the US is probably key examples. Has been quite an aggressive sanctions authority and dominating other countries to try and join their line politically. So that is sort of the framework. And then from a legal standpoint, what is the ultimate aim of sanctions? Well, in the UN context, it's simple. It's to restore international peace and security. Right? There's a very broad and vague concept, and then in the EU states that also adds that to promote human rights, democracy, rule of law, and then peace and security. So you have quite broad, but in practice, you see quite a range, right, Marianne?
Yeah, so sanctions are trying to change behavior, simply to make it too costly to continue to behave the way you're doing at the regime level. So it's not for everyone, it's to make the regime act differently. So there's a huge difference in the various goals they try to achieve. So, for example, it could be to end developing nuclear weapons. It could be to stop a war, as we see now. It could also be to try to impose some sort of regime change. So, in 1990, for example, sanctions were imposed on Iraq as they occupied Kuwait, and the idea or the hope was that it was going to end the occupation. But there was also hope that the economic downturn was going to trigger mass mobilization and lead to the downfall of Saddam Hussein. So the aims are various, but it's also many times sanctions can try to do different things at once.
Is there like a best case of sanction and a worst case of when they have worked and when they have not?
So I think there is some disagreement within the panel. I normally think about South Africa as a very successful case, where sanctions installed in the 1980s helped the movement in South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, and the apartheid regime. But I know you see that somewhat differently, Peter.
We can get onto that in a bit. I heard some of these speaking earlier today, and just to drag Ragnar into the conversation, you had one example of sanctions that actually have done their job quite good.
Yes, of course, sanctions can often work, and we have seen. Normally, we think that sanctions are a good country trying to change the behavior of a bad country. So we can come back to if that will work. But we also have an example of the opposite, at least from our point of view, that a bad country imposes sanctions on a good country, and it does indeed work. Because that you could see that as what China did against Norway after the Peace Prize in 2012. They imposed sanctions on Norway. So it was an autocracy that imposed sanctions on a democracy. We have our principles, but it seemed like these principles, they were for sale. So the sanctions, from the point of view of China, they were highly successful because they changed our behavior. So I think it's quite clear that in many cases, sanctions work. then, of course, the more difficult question is, do sanctions work when we need them to work? And it's a bit of a paradox here, because you could think that, say that sanctions were extremely effective. Then we would never observe them, because then only the threat of a sanction would change behavior. So we cannot only look at where did sanctions actually get imposed and conclude that in many of those cases they didn't work. We also have to take into account that, well, in some cases, maybe the threat of sanctions alone is enough to change behavior. And if sanctions would be very effective, then we would observe very few of them. And then, of course, the remaining question is, which Marianne knows much more about than me, but there is at least a connection in the data, so that sanctions actually are more effective when they are imposed against democracies than when they are imposed against dictatorships. And of course, then, if that is the case, then we have, at least from a democratic point of view, we have a paradox, because then sanctions works the worst when they are most needed. So I think it's a lot of paradoxes here. It's a lot of things we do not know, but of course there is very much research going on into this, and I'm sure we will come back to discuss this a bit more. But I think it is a paradox that we have seen that sanctions work in our own country.
So we've established that sanctions, we do this as an alternative to war, or maybe not only an alternative, but extra, and also that that they were trying to change the behavior of the country we were imposing sanctions on. So move back to the specific discussion on Russia against, or the Russian, the packages against Russia. We're now at the 6th package of sanctions from the EU. They are aimed at over 1,000 individuals, 100 companies. Half of the Russian central bank's reserves in other countries are frozen. We've kicked them out of the international payment system SWIFT, stopped exports and everything. But still, we haven't changed any of the behavior in Russia. Putin is saying this is not working. He has responded with cutting gas supply to Europe. Rising prices of energy has made his war chest even larger. So why is it not working as intended, or is it working as intended? Peter.
The first thing I always explain to people is that the war against Ukraine did not start this year, but it started in 2014 with the occupation of the Crimea. And when the Russians occupied the Crimea, Europe did not do a lot. Because all these things that you are mentioning, so every package that I see, every time there is a new announcement, I think I ask myself this question: is it really true that we were not yet doing this? Is this an increase in economic sanctions? Weren't we there from the start? So for me, I think if you take a look at the start of the conflict, you can see very well a number of the mechanisms that have been mentioned. The European Union, which is not only a democracy, but it is a combination of states that negotiate and try to get the least cost from the imposition of sanctions. So there is a national interest sometimes to not impose specific kind of measures. So that is one side of the conflict, and on the other side we see a dictator or an autocracy, or whatever you want to call it. And democracy is indeed weak if there is economic pressure being exerted. So you see Putin playing out his power, and that is one of the things that has been investigated. The counter-sanctions from Russia have worked quite well. They delivered damage where they were imposed. And the Europeans were very clever in designing economic sanctions that did not hurt Europe. So that is something where we really need to start thinking about. In my experience, I have never seen sanctions work unless they would also hurt the country that was imposing the economic sanctions. Now, do they work or do they not work? In foreign policy, it's always the question, does it work or does it not work? Aerial bombardments, what we see Putin doing right from the start. So this is really taking away physical, civilian infrastructure, houses, roads, that kind of bombardments. The success rate is 1 out of 3. And that is similar to economic sanctions. So then we are there, we are economists, we have instruments, we say they work probably to the same extent, but they both work to a much larger extent, they fail. So that is the problem. And doing nothing is not an alternative for our politicians.
Bård, you write editorials in Norwegian's biggest business newspaper and try to explain complex issues to readers within one page. So what is your take on this? Who is actually winning the sanctions war?
There's a really simple answer to the question, do sanctions work? Or in this case, do sanctions stop the war in Ukraine? And the answer is obviously not, because the war is still going on. So you could say that that was because we didn't design the right sanctions. And it was because we didn't design the right sanctions in 2014. And we don't know what would happen then if Europe was, and the US was really trying to hurt Russia back then, if they had invaded now. But my understanding of the sanctions and the history of sanctions is that they usually don't stop armed conflicts. And in this case, I think that they are obviously hurting the Russian economy. Maybe not so much as they could if we also would embargo the Russian oil and gas exports. But they are hurting, as Peter here showed earlier today, they are hurting the Russian economy quite substantial. But we know that Vladimir Putin is not in the business of maximizing the Russian GDP. So he doesn't care if the sanction hurts the Russian economy. But I think that if you, I don't know exactly when those news reports came, but at one point it was reported that Russia now had to strip dishwashers and refrigerators from microchips to put into their tanks because they didn't have access to microchips anymore. And that shows that this, if it doesn't stop the war, it's probably slowing Russia down. And also, of course, they can't buy any weapons apart from states which already has a pariah status in the international community, like North Korea and Iran. So that's the kind of states who now supplies Russia with weapons. And it's pretty obvious, I think, for everyone that we couldn't sell arms or dual-purpose goods to Russia in this situation. But I think that the lesson so far is that one should not be too hopeful for on the case of economic sanctions. I mean, the weapon supply the Western countries are giving is obviously much more significant in changing the course of the war.
So he doesn't care if the economy hurts, but does sanction on his friends, on his oligarchs, have any effect, you think?
It doesn't look like it, does it? I read a fantastic report about these kind of sanctions in the Financial Times. It was about the oligarch Michael Friedman. And as they were introducing these sanctions, he was obviously nervous. And he's Ukrainian by birth. So he got on the phone to one of the American top diplomats in Kiev. And he spoke a lot of his love for his native Ukraine, as the paper was saying. But then the report said, but then he got emotional. And he said that, you're going to take all my money. So you put a lot of pressure on these oligarchs. But I'm no expert on Russia or the oligarchs. But it doesn't seem that they have a very meaningful influence on Putin and his behavior.
Quick follow-up, Ragnar?
Yeah, so I think it's very important this about these targeted sanctions. I mean, we can try to crash the economy. Who will that hurt? Not obviously those that make the political decisions. We could do targeted sanctions against persons. It's an unclear effect of that. I mean, when you face a common enemy, it can also make you stronger internally. So if you're a small clique, then of course it's not obvious how targeted sanctions work. But it's also another type of target sanctions that Bård was mentioning, and that is targeted sanctions not on persons but on goods. And of course, if you could do targeted sanctions that kill off the Russian supply of weapons, like microchips, then it could work. But here, of course, is a paradox also, because Peter's research has shown, and I think that's relevant in this case, that the sanctions, they are very dependent on how much trade is there. And sanctions, you need a lot of countries to do the sanctions. But as long as China, which can supply part of what is needed and is 20% of the world economy, as long as they do not get on board, then I think also targeted sanctions against certain goods cannot be effective. And then, of course, the depressing solution is that if we cannot stop the weapons that Russia have, we have to supply the weapons to Ukraine. And it's a mix here, of course, between sanctions and weapons. And it's a very important difference that sanctions, you might need a lot of countries to rally together and agree. But weapons, you only need one country to provide. So it demands less of an agreement from the world society. And that makes it effective could make it effective in such a case. And that's, of course, a bit depressing.
So what Norway should do is send more guns? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I'm saying, I mean, I think many have been surprised of how united the West has become in supplying guns. I think that many of us would have said no to that answer a short time ago. That's kind of the last thing we want to do, is to send weapons. But I think in this situation, it's not weapons or sanctions, but I think that the sanctions in themselves will not be enough. And of course, you could also say that as long as we think it's morally fine to have a weapons industry in Norway, well, if we shall not give weapons to Ukraine in this situation, then also maybe we should shut down our weapons industry. Because then, I mean, then it's very few cases where it's so clear that it's one aggressor that has attacked another country and they need our help.
Do you agree, Marianne?
Oh yeah, we should definitely continue to send guns or much heavier stuff than guns. But I think we can do both. We can continue to send weapons, and we can also continue with the sanctions. So what I want to push a little bit is what we want. So we would really like to see Putin end this war, but I would also like to see Putin's regime end. That would be much better for world peace. It would be better for a lot of Russians. So what we know from research is that sanctions do not, one way they can help in these manners is to trigger mass mobilization. And we see that economic sanctions are connected to the likelihood of seeing mass mobilization. So it sends a signal to people that there are someone on your side. It sends a signal to the opposition that what they are fighting for is legitimate, and there's someone there who is willing to support them. So when we're looking at whether this has definitely not ended the war, and it's not triggered mass mobilization that's so far anywhere close to end Putin's regime, but these types of regimes tend to seem quite stable until they are not. So it's just too early to say whether this is going to succeed or not.
No, I just wanted to ask, how do we know that Putin will be succeeded by someone better? I mean, there must be some chance that he will be. It's difficult to imagine, but actually someone worse.
So most people are better than Putin. So I'm not sure he's going to be succeeded by someone better than him. But it takes a long, long time to consolidate as much power as Putin has. He has a lot of power in his hands, and this power is not embedded in the institutions, so it's not easy to transfer that power to someone else. And this power allows Putin to take on wars such as in Ukraine. Being a personalist regime increases the likelihood that you will see a war which is this hurtful. So seeing someone else equally bad, even worse, will possibly be better just because that person has not consolidated as much power as Putin has.
Just before you get the word, Ragnar, I just want to ask you, this is the most comprehensive sanctions ever imposed on a single country, according to the EU itself at least. So massive sanctions, and we're agreeing on that they have not done their job yet. So then is the question, do we have to wait longer or do we have to push harder? Do we need heavier sanctions to get any job done? Or is just Russia too big of a country, or Putin too crazy as an authoritarian leader that they will not affect him?
No, I think we have to push harder, both on sanctions and weapons. But of course, it is an important question, what will follow Putin? And this personalistic regime, where did it come from? So I think, sorry to say, but economists are partly to blame. Because we economists, when the Iron Curtain was falling apart at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, economists have, and I strongly believe in that, that the centrally planned economies, they turned out to be an economic failure. We felt we knew what we should replace it with, namely with a market economy. So we knew we were here and we were going there, hopefully. But we did not really understand that when you go to Prekestolen, as Peter will do tomorrow, you know where you start, you know where you end, but you also have to look at the map, how do we get there? And I think what happened in much of Eastern Europe when this process started was that we introduced, or we hoped to introduce, a market economy. What happened in many of these countries was a crash economically and socially. I mean, the expected living age in Russia went down by 10 years. So I think we economists, we often, we're a bit too narrow in taking into account what are the political and the social processes that links economics and politics. If you start on a path that you need to go very far down before you get up, it's not clear that you will ever get up. And I think we see this phenomenon in Russia. It created the regime we have today, but I think also we see it in the world today. I mean, if we think about, can you separate social problems from economics? Probably not. Many of us, what we think of as stupid policies in, say, Britain and the US maybe. They have not had a very good development. Why is it that in these countries they got into such a political mess? Well, these are the countries that also have the lowest social mobility, the highest income differences, and I think we need to look more into what are the political effects of going in a downturn or going towards a situation where there is a big difference and increasing difference between people. I think we do not fully understand the economic and the political consequences of this, and this personalized regime in Russia, I think, is one example that we sent off Russia on a path that was not socially sustainable because it was not economically sustainable in the short run.
Thomas?
Yeah, I would just also was to touch on your point in terms of the EU saying this is the most comprehensive sanctions regime. And I think sometimes we may get the impression that EU bureaucrats confuse the point of comprehensive sanction, also the longest legal text, right? Yeah. So you have long addendums, and it's just about making long legal texts. And one point here is that Russia is such a huge international player, so it's sort of unfair to use that as example in the discussion when we're discussing broadly in terms of whether or not sanctions are effective, because we're kind of a unique position with the EU dependency on Russia for petroleum export, and also, of course, Norway is also in a unique position with being our significant neighbor. So, and the point of that is, you see that it's been a hesitant. Everybody knows that, for instance, well, how to hurt Russia will try to attack the petroleum industry. But then again, we're back to, okay, that entails a huge sacrifice and cost on our side. So you see, in an attempt to sort of navigate these targeted sanctions, you try to write complex instrument where you not really want to attack them where they hurt because you're afraid that will hurt yourself, but then you're finding intricate ways of writing around that, saying, okay, you can't, we're not banning oil imports, but you're not allowed to deliver that specific type of pipe, and you're not allowed to consult someone about that pipe. But by all means, continue to import that. So, and the key point here is the whole rationale about thinking about sanctions, discussing the effect is sanctions is essentially a legal instrument where the state is signaling to you how they want you to act in order to receive the desired outcome. And if the whole instrument is so complex that you are just puzzled about what are they really trying to signal us, then we'll back at, well, are they really targeted to achieve that desired effect?
So are we kind of fooling ourselves, or are we doing these sanctions to feel good ourselves? That it's the least costly thing to do in a conflict like this one?
I think we're fooling ourselves in terms of slightly in terms of we have this idealistic notion that there are someone in the EU that are really sitting down trying to how to navigate and find the best effective sanctions and target them and not to have collateral damage. When in reality you have a sort of political discussion and trying to find just compromises which results in strange instruments that really aren't tailored to achieve best possible effects, but are more a result that this is the best we can do, and then sort of leave it to companies to try and sort it out. I think that's.
I want to go on to discussing a bit about the side effects of these sanctions. We're seeing in Europe that a consequence of the sanctions is that Putin has restrained the gas supply to Europe. Power prices are going up, gas prices are going up. I work at Lyse, so I'm the guy sending the power bills. So I know that our customers are feeling the sanctions. Could you please elaborate a bit on that, on how what are the side effects of the people in Europe on these sanctions on the micro level, or also on the bigger picture? Are we sending Russia and the arms to China, for instance, or other countries? Will they always find a way to operate the way they always wanted to?
You ask an awful lot of questions.
Pick one.
So I think the most important point to make is that we should try to think as clear as possible about this situation. And it does not help if we think about Putin as a villain and as a completely irrational kind of person. It makes it worse if we think about the Russians also like our enemy. And that is what we are triggered into. what we should not forget is that we do not have one instrument available that might otherwise have been available, and that is military support. We can deliver weapons to the Ukraine, but we cannot fight, because we know that then there is a risk of a nuclear conflict. And that is what is driving us towards the corner where we are now, and where we are using the sanctions to do something, and where we are delivering weapons, rightly as you said, against what we would have done only a year ago. And this is the trap of a war. And this is the trap of what you see on television. And this is the trap of how we are fooled. And if you think that democracies, people in democracies cannot be fooled, then we take a look at America, and then we see that in a democracy things are also possible, where we now feel that this is the architecture of Putin. And what we see in the United States is that there is a big and organized group that is on his track, and still on Trump's track, despite everything that has happened, despite everything that has been on television. And it is the same in Russia. In Russia, the people are also not seeing clearly what is happening, in our view. So I think that is something which is very important to consider. Now, you also asked about, do we have to wait? Yes, we have to wait. We have simply started too late. We should have started in 2014 with serious sanctions. That is a lesson that we have learned now. And we have not, when people were saying it's unprecedented, I was always thinking, yes, it is unprecedented because there is this increase in the number of people that is going to hurt by the sanctions. But look, it is not really something that is material in an economy. If you are hitting in a big country like Russia, hitting like 1,000 people, and that is what the list is about at this moment. There's more, but that is what we have seen, and people were simply reporting the number of cases. I think that what you said about the length of the law, of the regulations, that is something which gives a very good indication of what was being done. Finding individuals that could be targeted in the hope that it would work. And I agree that it does not work yet. And I hope that it will work.
So I think we also need to look forward and think about what is the opposite of sanctions. Could that work? Because as we see it now, we are, as a country, we are a winner. We earn a lot of money because energy prices are very high. And the West is also a winner because the West can crush the Russian army on foreign soil by giving weapons. Who are the losers? The losers are obviously the Ukrainians. So what will then the opposite of sanctions be? The opposite of sanctions is that, well, we are the winners, we earn money, the destruction is not on our soil, it's on foreign soil. So the opposite of sanctions, which I think is very important when that time comes, is that we recognize that we are actually the winners of this conflict. And the opposite of sanctions would then be that we should use a lot of money to rebuild Ukraine on a moral basis. But also if you think about on a military basis, if you think about the West, we are crushing the Russian army, and we don't face destruction of property. We don't feel the loss of lives, but the Ukrainians do. And therefore, I think that looking beyond sanctions, it's very important that we make it clear that however big the destructions are, we will be there to assist when Ukraine is going to build back up.
Bård, if we look down the road, if we have, I don't know, maybe 5, 7, 10 years of this conflict going on with high energy prices in Europe, Norway also, do you think that, what do you think are going to be those kind of side effects? Are we going to see any political instability in Europe? Are people who are united now in the West gonna turn on each other, or
well, I'm no political scientist, and I would also like to point out that after Ragnar Torvik's critique of economists, I'm not an economist either. So I've studied business administration. I think that Peter was speaking about this earlier today, that sanctions create a window of opportunity for about 3 to 4 years. And the reason, I guess, is that it's a shock for the country at first, and then trade find new ways. But I think the situation with Russia is a bit different, because the short-term effect of reduced exports of oil and gas is very high prices. So they're kind of insulated against any. You know, the West hasn't really sanctioned gas, but Putin has done that himself. But the effect is the same, that output is reduced and the price goes up. But over time, he will get a very big problem with selling his gas. And he have to construct new pipes and so on. But still, it will be very difficult. And now he has nowhere to put it. So you can see now he's have to resort to burn the gas. And then the next thing he has to do is to plug the wells. And they may be very expensive and also difficult to get up in production. So you could argue that over the long run, the cost will be very substantial for Russia, even if they're making a lot of money now. And then for the West, it's the kind of opposite, because until I think 2025, there will be no new gas capacity coming online, but then you will have more, and Europe will also have more time to build more renewables and so on. So we will probably get it better over time, and Russia will fare worse.
Ragnar, yeah?
Yes, I want to follow up on your question about will we stick together, and I think that is an open question, and of course that is what Putin is betting on, that we will not stick together in the West because it will be so unpleasant. For instance, with these high energy prices, that you start to see cracks in the wall, and of course, if we think about it. Over the last years, we have in some sense stuck together. Like when the COVID came, Norway was allowed in to get vaccines shared from the European countries. That meant, of course, that on an expected basis, people in Europe were losing lives so that we could save lives in Norway. And then I think it is a bit of a paradox that when we now see the war, when there is a shortage of energy in Europe, it's a quite substantial number of Norwegian politicians that put emphasis on that we need to say it bluntly, we need to stop exports of energy so that we can heat up our winter houses in the mountain. And I think that we should remember that if someone has been solidaric against us, giving us vaccines, this is not the time to subsidize rich Norwegians' winter vacations.
You have a winter cabin, Thomas? That's why you asked for the word?
No, I'm just agreeing on the point in terms of the sticking together part. And I think that is a sort of a positive side of what has been otherwise an imposition of sanctions that we criticize in terms of the way it's been done. But the good point is the way that it's been done, at least in concert by a lot of international community, the G7 countries. And that's been a problem with other sanctions regimes, that essentially you have different countries playing their own tune, and then you're left with the international community and companies and persons trying to navigate different laws, different policies. For instance, you have a company that that does international business, and then you have business in several jurisdictions. Then one jurisdiction said you can do this, and the other saying no, you definitely cannot do that. So I think that's a positive outcome. If you want to have an effective sanctions regime, you need to act in concert, and you need to key international players, and that has definitely been the case now. Even traditionally, there's been some tensions in the EU and US in terms of how to tailor-make the sanctions for targeted effects, and there's been a lot more unison approach now.
So Peter say I'm asking too many questions. So let's hear from you guys instead. Does anyone have a question for the panel? Yeah, over here. We only have this microphone, so you have to scream it to us.
I'll do my best. My name is Harald Hamre. I'm a historian, and I can't think about any conflict as serious as this, where sanctions, economic sanctions, have not been used. It's always been used in international conflicts, severe as this. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion about sanctions. But my question is there an alternative? Do any of you have an alternative to these sanctions, even if we may discuss whether they work or not?
So the question is, what is the alternative to sanctions?
Weapons.
The strange thing is, of course, that the first thing we offered to Zelensky was that he could get refugee and that he would be safe with his government. But it is the first thing that Europe offered. And we understand why the Ukraine has done what it did. And I don't say that the world is better when this war would not have been waged the way it is being done. But we need to be prepared to also think the things that we do not like to see. And whether it is realistic or not that Ukraine is part of a Western sphere of influence or of a Russian sphere of influence. And the reason that I raised the issue is because I've been trained to think about peace. It is far more difficult for me to think about war.
Kalle in the back.
It came too late, so maybe this has been raised already. But I think sanctions work when there is opposition in the country that you strengthen by and they ask for sanctions. That seems to be the experience. It worked in South Africa, it worked in Rhodesia, and worked in countries where you had an opposition against the ruler. But in Russia, it seems to be no opposition against it. So I'm not quite sure how well it worked. It seems to be more cement and loyalty to Putin more than army.
Marianne.
Well, it's a very good and somewhat depressing point, but there is an opposition. So we did see protests when the war started. Before the war, when Navalny was put into prison, 200,000 people got into the streets in St. Petersburg. That's a pretty big opposition. So the opposition is there. I think you're completely right. For sanctions to work in autocracies, there must be an opposition they can work through. But what research shows us is that sanctions tend to increase the likelihood that we see protests, but it also increases the likelihood that those protests are successful. So it increases the number of people who participate. It increases the likelihood that we see security force defection, members of security forces joining the protests, and the likelihood that they, in the end, succeed. So, but the fact that we haven't seen that yet doesn't mean that we're not going to see that in the future.
But does the common Russian feel the sanctions enough to make them mobilize against Putin, or seems like we're not even close to that?
So I don't think the common Russian is going to mobilize against Putin because there are sanctions. I think that if they're going to mobilize, it's because they want a different type of regime. What they are feeling is his political decisions which are not good for Russia. Like, it's not. It doesn't provide a good economy for most Russians. So that's why we would see mobilization, not only at least because of the sanctions.
I think I saw one more question here. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, I'm Harold. I'm a designer, and I'm wondering what can we learn from like the two last big wars? It's like the Versailles Treaty that wasn't really a good set of sanctions towards Germany, and also this Marshall help after the Second World War. Should we like be ready to pose like a massive Marshall help towards Russia when they are ready to change the regime or when they have done it?
Anyone? Yeah, Ragnar?
I think that would be a possibility, but conditional on that we have some institutional change towards democracy, because we know that it's not always the solution. You don't always put out a fire by throwing money on it. But we have seen that if you think about countries that earn a lot of money, be it from gifts from other countries or from oil or whatever, it's a very big difference between getting a lot of money in a democracy where they can be put to use, or getting a lot of money in an autocracy where it can only strengthen the regime. So conditional on this institutional change, I would be open to do that. And as you say, the Marshall help, in some sense, was that model, right? It was Europe is going to democratize. We need to help them, and to stabilize that process, we can give them help. And I think we should be open for the same against Russia.
More questions?
Could you maybe give some remarks on the reports from Yale on the sanctions? Are they biased optimistically, or they seem to say that sanctions are having an effect?
Are you talking about the reports of the lists of companies that have been withdrawn? No. I know Yale has a project that providing statistics on companies who have withdrawn. Is that the one?
Yeah, they're using documentation information they find from Russia and trying to present a different narrative that maybe was provided publicly. Yale University.
Okay. Yeah, so go ahead, Pete.
I know about the research, and this afternoon I said the first casualty of a war is official statistics, and that's also the case in Russia. It is not, but it has always been the case with economic sanctions. It takes very long to puzzle out what has happened on the floor, and actually it's something for academics, not for policymakers or for ordinary people. And one of the things we have not really been talking about is that sanctions really hurt. If the sanctions bite, they are bad for health. They are typically bad for education. They are typically bad for gender. The only thing I can say to the defense of sanctions is that the same is true of war. So I think that it is wise to take a look at alternative narratives that are being developed by researchers, to be critical about that. But it is also possible to think as an economist about, should these sanctions work or shouldn't they work? And if you have an overview, you know that we started late. It will at least take some time before they're going to bite. And I would bet on continuing with the sanctions to see if the results emerge. But the results never are to destruct Russia. The results must always be to see if it is possible to change the negotiations that will take place in this conflict, to make it to an end. And my research is showing that this is a window of opportunity. We have 2 to 3 to 4 years where we can do something, and then Russia is no longer capable of being influenced by economic sanctions, just like we don't have an impact on North Korea anymore, because we don't do anything with North Korea.
we have time for one more question before we need to round up. If there is any. Here, yeah?
You said that for sanctions to work, they have to hurt us as well as them. Do you have any examples how we can do that?
Well, if it doesn't hurt us, then it doesn't hurt them. That is the rule, right? So it is impossible to hurt another country unless it also hurts you. And because you want to hear something positive at the end of this this depressing thing, I don't think that the high energy prices are bad. I think that in terms of problems in the world as a whole, for me it is environment, and I think that in 10, 15 years we will be happy that we have seen this tremendous increase in prices, because it works on the floor. It's difficult, but it works. People are investing, changing their behavior, and that is something that would never have happened without Putin.
We're gonna let everyone in the panel have some closing remarks, and I would like you to ask you a final question on what you think will be next from now, or what do you hope will be next?
Okay, so what I hope will be next. So I still have hope in the Russian opposition. Like, I hope they are going to be able to find their momentum. It's not easy. It's extremely hard in repressive regimes. The people are out there are so brave, and I just hope that's going to trigger a wave of protests that can just change the whole dynamics within the regime.
Thomas, what should we do next?
I think we should have a real look at sanctions as an instrument, from policymakers and authorities need to do a more thorough job in designing them in a more smarter way to actually make them targeted to reduce the negative impacts on third parties. I think ultimately, it's a good example. Someone made the similarity between sanctions and alchemy. Essentially, you have a black box that you are hitting with the economic sanctions, and then you are hoping that gold in the form of policy change comes out.
Bård?
I will just say two things. First, I disagree that gas prices, which compares to like $500 oil, is a good thing. I mean, if there's a unusual cold winter this year in Europe, or maybe even more next year, a lot of people will freeze to death, and because they can't afford to heat their homes. So while we need taxes on fossil fuels, it's not a good thing when prices of basic energy skyrocket. The other thing, Marshall help to Russia? No. We have to give money to Ukraine. And we are not giving the amount of money that are pledged, which Zelensky recently pointed out. And the worst offenders is European countries, which for some reason I think that they're worried about corruption or things like that. Things are not done in Ukraine. Things are not done like it is in the EU. But I think that it's insane to demand that right now. I think the Ukrainian GDP is maybe down 30%. A third of the energy infrastructure doesn't work. And they have to repair it before winter, and they need cash. And I can't understand why we are not sending more money.
Ragnar, what should we do next?
I agree to that. More money now. I think that what comes next, of course, is basically impossible to say. But if we try to look into the future, it's quite clear that Russia they have not achieved much in Ukraine. It's very clear that in the long term, it is impossible for Russia to control the population in Ukraine. So maybe they're hoping for the winter to turn their luck, But I think that this, maybe it's a hope or more than a prediction, but that the war in Ukraine will end in a not too distant future. I'm more pessimistic about the development in Russia, I must say. And that is a danger. If you think about Russia, if you think about China, if you think about the world today, where 70% of the people live in dictatorships, where we have seen, we have a long period of democratizations, but they have gone back. So the average level of the democracy in the world today is the same as it was in 1989. So I think we are seeing a number of bad political developments in big and important countries, and I don't really see how we could do anything to turn that around. I'm afraid.
We'll give the last word of the evening to our guest, Peter.
Well, we are all guests.
I know, but you're a little bit extra of a guest coming all the way from Netherlands to visit us.
We need to take an example from Ukraine. Go on. Take the costs and go on. Yeah.
Brief but precise. Thank you so much for participating in this very interesting panel. Thank you for all the discussion. Thank you for your questions. If I have read the program correctly, there's not an event starting here until an hour from now. So be happy to have a beer, maybe ask some more questions to the panel if they stick around. Thank you for coming and enjoy KÅKÅnomics.